Welcome to Talent X,
the Talent Experience podcast featuring authentic conversations on the future of work,
empowering you to better understand and deliver a best-in-class, future-proofed career experience.
For more insightful conversations, visit talentxpodcast.com.
We hope you enjoy this episode of the Talent X podcast.
Hello, I'm John Holland, and welcome to Talent X, the Talent Experience podcast. Today's guest is Matt Thomas. Matt is a senior human resource executive with more than 20 years of generalist HR experience, leading teams in the delivery of transformational change, people strategy, building high-performing leadership teams and culture, HR digital transformations, and building leading-edge employee experiences. For the past 8 years, Matt held the position of GM People and Culture at Racing and Wagering Western Australia, transforming the people space from a traditional operation to an innovative and strategic one. And he's currently consulting other companies to help them achieve similar success. In addition, Matt currently chairs the Future Now board, which is the largest training council in Western Australia, responsible for the creative, leisure, and technology industries. He's also a regular guest speaker at Curtin University for HR and MBA students, as well as an HR disruptor at HR think tanks. Matt also says that he's pretty passionate about giving back to a profession that has done so much for him. So for the past 4 years, he's mentored a half dozen mentees through the Australian Human Resources Institute mentoring program. Matt, you are busy. That's a lot. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks, Sean. Yes, there's definitely an enriching time I've had over the especially last 10 years.
I bet. You know, I've worked with a great many human resource professionals, and I've written a lot about the ebb and flow of HR practices, but I've never really had a guest with the HR background you have on a Talent X podcast. So this is a wonderful opportunity to get some well-needed perspective.
Fantastic. Thanks, John.
So let's get started. I hate to always inject the global pandemic and lockdown into a discussion, but it's the defining event of the century so far, and perhaps in our lifetimes. So let me ask you, what do you think are the most important things HR has learned over the past 15 months? And what is important for us moving ahead, both for HR and for the organizations we work with?
Yeah, look, it's still such a relevant and relevant topic for most organisations. The pandemic, even experiencing in Australia, we're very fortunate in the sense that we weren't too impacted. But, recently we just put on a 3-day lockdown ourselves because of a quarantine breach. So it just shows you just how relevant and how long lasting it's still going to be a factor, I suppose, within organisations. I think for us as an organisation, the last 15 months was pretty telling on many fronts. We had, as a business ourselves, had actually been going through quite a bit of change through privatisation. And as we know, most organisations are going through some sort of disruption. And I think COVID just added another level of complexity for us. What I'd say the key learnings for me from a HR perspective was very much around the resilience of the workforce. The ability to actually be agile and nimble and be able to take on the challenges that were actually presented at the time in a fairly confronting space for a lot of people was quite, what would I say? It was quite eye-opening for our perspective because we had already been through quite a lot of change. And I think one of the things that was really quite poignant for me was actually around the type of mindsets that actually were needed to actually navigate through that time. We talk a lot about skills that actually will start to evolve over that 15 or over that period of time. But I think what was more telling was the mindsets that actually needed to change to actually adapt to a fairly new environment where maybe what got you to where you got to now wasn't going to get you where you needed to moving forward. I think from a HR perspective, I think the ability for us to actually make sure we were engaging with the key stakeholders and leaders in the business was really important to actually support them, because the reality is, we know is when you go through change like this, people are impacted in very different ways. So one size fits all didn't necessarily work. And I think it was also about knowing the fact that you didn't have all the answers. You were very reliant on people's feedback, and to be actually authentic about actually saying, we don't have all the answers, we need you to help us, guide us through this process, was one of the key things that we learnt very quickly that actually helped support our strategy moving forward. I think, the power of communication was pretty important. There's always that polarizing topic, not enough, too much, not the right format, the right way. I think we took the approach that communication was very critical. So I'd rather go hard and be told we gave too much than necessarily not enough in that particular time because of all the challenges. But I think, whenever there is adversity, there's always great learnings and lessons for organisations. And, I'm sure you'd agree, John, you shouldn't have to go through that process in the first place to have those learnings. But the fact is we did, and it was out of our control. And it was very important for us to learn from that as well. I think moving forward, what we've probably learned from a HR and organisation perspective is that flexible work practices and employee wellbeing are no longer a nice to have for an organisation. They are critical, and they are critical in the sense of how they enable businesses to be able to navigate, these times where it requires a different focus and a different direction. I think, we were one of those organisations that wanted to really push into the flexible work practices before, but there was an engagement at the top, and it basically stymified, I suppose, the ability to be able to do it. And, obviously, like many organisations, we had no choice, and we actually saw the benefits, which I always kind of deep down knew would be the case. But, the reality is that it took that actual moment for us to actually achieve that.
It's funny, you talk about mindset. One of the things that really surprised me a little bit, although this happens when people are sort of up against a wall and don't have maybe all the options they would like, but the mindset about remote work so dramatically changed here in the States, especially. And my sense is most of the English speaking world had changed, where my experience was companies were pushing back against that. The change they'd made in letting people do it was incremental. And then suddenly when, hey, we are going to need to have our workforce working remotely in part or the whole group of them, suddenly companies and organizations dramatically changed, and suddenly their mindset changed. So I was surprised by that. I'm not sure if that's what you experienced in Australia. Certainly that's what we experienced up here in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how it then evolved from that initial, start of having to change a workforce dynamic to, going from no people or everyone in the office to no one in the office, except we had certain roles where they actually had to stay in the office. So it was a very challenging time. They felt like they were being disadvantaged, not being treated the same way because there was such a focus on those that actually were not working in the office. So you had to kind of balance that and understand the impact of that. But I think where we got to towards the end of it was that, we almost said that as long as people were in the office at least 2 days a week, we weren't concerned about if they wanted to spend all days in the week, that was fine, but as long as there was a minimum of 2 days in the office. And it became really interesting to see how organisations navigate that, because there was a lot of organisations that said you could work from home the whole time, and we lost people to different organisations for that. But that wouldn't be a model that necessarily at that stage in our business would actually be supportive of what we needed to from a business perspective. So it's very much you have to actually, it's not something you can set in stone and in concrete. It has to be something that evolves through the time.
Matt, we were talking about this earlier, but I noticed on your LinkedIn profile that you talk about things like transformational change and building a high performance culture. Are those things even more important today as we try to navigate this new world of work?
Absolutely, John. I think if you think about business success and business performance, there's a direct correlation to an organisational culture and obviously the people that drive it. Without people, typically businesses don't perform. And when you think about the disruptive nature, I suppose, of the world that we've been in and the impact it has had on a lot of organisations in regards to, that sort of survival mode that they've had to sit in while they've waited to navigate through whatever challenges they've had that COVID have presented. I think, most organisations that are still around are now having to shift very quickly from that survival mode into almost the growth mindset or growth mode. And so, a high-performing culture is obviously an enabler of that even more so. You need people that effectively are very clear around what the business objectives are, the strategic direction, and how they can actually contribute and work towards that. But at the same time, it's about making sure they've got all the sorts of peripheral stuff like tools to do their job, that they have the opportunity to feel like they work in a culture where there is innovation and it is okay to take risks, recognised for effort. And to me, that's kind of some of the sort of key requirements of a high-performing culture. I think, the high-performing culture may look very different in today's world, though. Different areas of focus. If you think about what COVID's brought on about the enabling a workforce remotely, so high-performance culture might have a different correlation. But either way, if an organisation is having to actually go from a survival to a growth mindset, it absolutely requires transformation, and that's where that transformation piece definitely comes in. I always think, in today's world, what got you to where you are now is not necessarily going to get you where you need moving forward, and that's why it's really important that that transformational piece works as well, in line with a high-performing culture. I use the synergy of these days when you start looking at new tech, for instance, what's new today probably in a month's time is going to be obsolete. So how do you actually keep that continuous loop of actually assessing things that are actually going to add value to, whether it's about efficiencies, it's around experiences, whether it's to do with the customers. I think businesses will only succeed when they continually find ways of adapting because of new technology, new ways of working, new mindsets.
Do you think it's hard for HR to sort of step to the forefront and take that role to sort of help drive the change? Because I don't know how things are in your world, but here in the States, I've dealt with a lot with HR people, and they very much are very rule-based. Got to have the rules, got to follow the rules, it's compliance, all of these things. And a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here kind of had to get made up on the fly, which I don't think, at least from the HR people I know up here, is particularly their strong suit. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, look, I don't think we're any different. Over in Australia, there's always a view that HR is the police, and we tend to hide behind policies and rules. And my view has always been that those rules and policies are there as a framework, as a boundary. And generally, most of the time, we create the policies, so we can always rechange them to some degree. But it's about not hiding behind them. Sometimes they are absolutely critical in protecting risk and organisational, reputational, brand, etc. But I think HR plays a significant role in not necessarily us driving, because where I've seen success really cut through is when you actually enable others, and almost like the HR is the puppet master, if I use that sort of reference, in a sense that we're enabling others to drive the change. Because when leadership or employees drive the change that you're looking for, 9 times out of 10, it was more likely to be adopted and embraced within the organisation, as opposed to HR telling you that this is what you should do because it's the right thing to do. And I think that was probably one of the lessons, again, or learnings as part of this whole change over the last 15 months. We had a pretty good, I sat on the executive, so I had a say at the table. We had a pretty good reputation around the value that we add. I think it just probably reinforced the value even more in regards to the whole experience of COVID and for us even privatisation, in the sense of the value that we can bring in enabling rather than doing, I think is the key thing.
That's a really important point, that sometimes the value that HR brings is appreciated the most when you have a crisis like we all had. And HR has to step up. And, I think a lot of times the human resource function doesn't get a lot of credit for all the things that they do, because they're behind the scenes a lot. And here's one where they had to really, really step up and out in the public eye and be seen for, hey, what are you going to do to help keep our business working and together and moving ahead, even if all the people aren't in the same place?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Hey, let's talk about something else that may have changed in the past year: employee experience. It seems like a lot of organizations have finally woken up to the fact that they need to do a lot more with and for their workers. Things like helping them to reskill or retrain so they can be more flexible and agile and useful to the business. It's great that this is finally happening, but a bit sad that it took a huge global shakeup to do it. What's your perspective about that?
Yeah, I agree in the sense that, again, sometimes adversity provides learning opportunities, and, the reality is it's actually opened up a door that will open eyes up to an area that actually I think is one of the most critical things in organisations moving forward. As you already read and mentioned, John, I'm pretty passionate about the employee experience. I
can tell.
I think I was talking about employee experience back in the last FuelX conference in Sydney in 2019, and I think we've taken a pretty big shift because the focus has always been on employee engagement, and for me, employee experience drives engagement. So we took a considerable shift around how we looked at the things that we did was more around experience, not trying to focus on the engagement. So I think for me, employee experience has definitely become more of a relevant and aware topic or a function that needs to be explored within organisations. For us, of our 3 strategic pillars, one of the strategic pillars was employee experience. That's how critical it was for us in the organisation. But it means many things to people, and I think that was part of the journey that we learnt. And for me, I always also put into the fact that candidate experience is just as important as employee experience. They're actually intricately linked. Employee experience talks about the impact and all the sorts of things that sit underneath that from an employee experience, but you're also in a world of talent, borderless talent, and trying to attract key talent. The candidate experience is also an opportunity where you drive the same experience before they even consider you as an employer. I think, so when I think about employee experience, it's very much everything from, people about having a voice around within their team. It's about having the skill, being able to identify the skills which they may not even realise they have, and how they actually want to develop that. It's that career path and perspective. It's creating environments where they feel inclusive and can be their true self. And it's all the other practical things around, the work setup. Now you throw remote in, so obviously there's a different sort of concept there that you have to consider. But I think, I know definitely from our experience, when we were actually getting high scores in employee experience, we could see the benefits, not just from an engagement perspective, but also from a performance and productivity perspective, and also directly correlated to our customer experience as well. So I think it's absolutely opened the eyes to a lot of organisations, but there's the risk that people will see that as a tokenistic approach, and it's really important to understand that if you go in this with a very tokenistic approach, you'll be caught out pretty quickly, because employees want to see authenticity when they're dealing with their employer in regards to the experience that they create for them in the workplace.
Well, and that's something else I believe came front and center, that authenticity piece during the lockdown. Companies had to really sort of be straight with their employees about what's going to happen, how's your job going to be, can you do this, and that. How difficult is it for HR to manage remote employees? I've got to think it's a pretty big challenge. Some people will take to it real well and you can trust them and let them run. Others don't work so well in that environment yet. You had to make a quick fix here in many cases. How has that gone? What's your take on that?
There's definitely been some learnings in that, and I think before COVID came in and we did the remote working, a lot of people thought, "Oh, remote working is awesome. I'd love to do that." But then when reality kicked in, and they actually had to do that on a day-to-day basis for a period of time, it was they had a very different view of it afterwards. So, it's what you don't know. Sometimes people found out that as well. The biggest issue from working from home is around trust. Fortunately or unfortunately, sometimes, your leaders will drive that expectation or not drive that expectation. So how do you get in front of your leaders to say, we weren't an organisation that wanted to be able to measure exactly the outputs that we're doing. We had to find other ways of being able to make sure that they were still delivering and felt, they still had access to all the things they would if they were in a workplace. But it is a difficult mindset shift. And it can go to extreme. What we almost found is that people, when kind of our restrictions really died off, was, well, why can't we work from home every day of the week? So there's a fine line between it being, trying to be as a benefit and supporting, to then becoming an entitlement. And so navigating that expectation to some degree was really important. Hence why we said 2 days in the office was, more than reasonable. I'm a fairly social person, so my challenge was very much around, I found it really challenging to do remote workshops because I like to be in a room and understand. And it wasn't that you couldn't do that. and wasn't like able to, but it was just the fact that it had a different feel to it. So I think sometimes it's around, we had to be very clear about what are the meetings that we need to be in the office for and what days. And so we rallied around that, and the rest of it was more flexible. So I think it's really about creating environments that best support the team in what they have to deliver and their particular, I suppose, behavioural fit, I suppose, of the team, because each team is different, unique in different ways and how they have to work.
Well, in 2 days in the office, it strikes me, is a good thing for another reason. That is culture. I mean, how do you hold together the culture of the organization if so many people are working at home all the time? Because what gets lost, and this is the thing that I missed the most, was the kind of ad hoc conversations you have in an office environment where you're getting a cup of coffee and you bump into a person, or somebody sticks their head in your office or your cube and asks you about one thing, and you end up having a whole different conversation because you got onto something else. Those things don't happen nearly as seamlessly in a remote environment. So having people in the office a couple of days a week, I think, is good because it helps keep your culture intact.
Absolutely. And I don't have an answer for the cultural question unless you do, John. But I think what I would say is that, that connection piece, that social connection piece is important for human beings generally, in most cases. And I think what you then lost in some cases with not the workforce being in the office, you had to find different ways of creating that remotely. And then there are ways of doing it. Did it hit the same sort of mark as if you're in the office? Not necessarily, but if the way that the business was heading, that there was going to be this mix, you had to find a way that worked for you at the end of the day. And for us, typically, you talk about the water cooler conversations you have in the corridor. That was one way that we were able to pick up very quickly around engagement feedback, or some of the hotspots of feedback. So again, we had to find different ways of being able to do that in a way that wasn't about face-to-face interaction.
Well, we are rapidly running out of time here. This always happens. We get going talking, and we could talk for a long time, and we have a very short amount of time to hit. So let me ask you one more thing. Here at the TalentX podcast, we wholeheartedly believe everyone should have a job that they love and they're passionate about. So Matt, what do you love about what you do?
Well, I must admit, I do love the opportunity to be in a leadership role, because it is a privilege. I don't see that anything less. And being able to actually work with people where you can have a direct impact on their aspirations, their career, even their personally and professionally, it's definitely been something that I've really cherished over my fairly long career. I think it's also very fortunate that I work in an industry that has given me so much and so many lessons about myself. So tying in HR and people, and also having leading teams, is definitely something that I'm very grateful for, but also something that I really am passionate about, because being able to see the potential in people and actually getting to see it realised, I think, is something that not many people get the opportunity to do in their careers.
Well, Matt, thank you for spending a little time with us today. It's great to talk to such a great HR pro like yourself and to get your perspective. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So for the Fuel 50 TalentX podcast, this is John Holland. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the TalentX podcast.
For more talent experience and future of work conversations, visit talentxpodcast.com.
Follow us on Twitter at TalentX Podcast.
Or join the conversation with #TalentX Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter.
TalentX, the Talent Experience podcast, was brought to you by the fabulous Fuelies at Fuel 50.